There are a lot of ways to start a neighborhood dispute, but most of them don't end with a Tesla shooting sparks in the middle of the night while the owner screams on her front lawn. And I'll be honest with you, that definitely wasn't the outcome I imagined when I first built my solar system. All I wanted was a quiet house, a little independence, and the satisfaction of knowing I could power my own life without relying on the grid. But sometimes, the moment you build something good, somebody else decides it belongs to them. And in my case, that somebody was a woman named Evelyn Thorne. Now, before I get into Evelyn, you have to understand something about me. I'm an electrical engineer by trade, been doing it close to 20 years now. Industrial systems, mostly power distribution, control panels. The kind of work where one wrong calculation can shut down an entire factory floor. I'm not the loudest guy in the room, never have been. I'm the type who'd rather spend a Saturday afternoon wiring a battery bank than arguing with someone at a barbecue. Which is exactly what I did for almost 2 straight years. Weekends, holidays, evenings after work. Piece by piece, I built what I always called my independence project. A fully off-grid solar system. Not one of those little rooftop setups that just lowers your electric bill a bit. I'm talking about a complete standalone system. Solar array on the roof and back shed. 3 battery banks in the garage. Custom inverters, manual transfer panels. Everything engineered and installed by me. When I finished it, the system could run my whole house easily. And on a good sunny week, it generated more power than I even needed. It wasn't about saving money. Honestly, I probably spent close to 30 grand building it. But there's something deeply satisfying about flipping a switch and knowing every watt flowing through that wire came from sunlight hitting your own roof. No utility company, no outages, just quiet, reliable power. I even installed an outdoor charging port beside my driveway, so I could plug in my pickup's battery system and any tools I needed. It looked like a normal EV charger, but it was tied directly into my private system. Important detail. Because technically, that electricity never touched the public grid. It was mine. And for the first few months, everything worked perfectly. Peaceful neighborhood. Friendly neighbors. Kids riding bikes down the street. Typical suburban stuff. Then Evelyn Thorne discovered the charger. Now Evelyn lived 3 houses down from me. Early 50s maybe, always dressed like she was about to attend a town council meeting. Perfect hair, perfect posture, and the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. She was also, unfortunately, the president of our homeowners association. Technically, she was voted in. But from what I heard around the neighborhood, nobody else actually wanted the job. So Evelyn took it and treated it like she'd just been sworn in as mayor. Suddenly, the neighborhood had standards. Mailbox colors had to match approved tones. Trash bins couldn't be visible from the street. One guy down the block got a warning letter because his American flagpole was slightly misaligned with community aesthetics. I wish I was kidding. Most people just rolled their eyes and ignored her. But when I installed my solar panels, Evelyn noticed immediately. She showed up in my driveway one afternoon holding a clipboard. Actual clipboard. She stood there looking up at my roof like I'd mounted a satellite dish the size of Texas. Those panels, she said, tapping the board with her pen, weren't approved by the HOA Architectural Committee. I wiped my hands on a rag and walked over. Well, good thing the city approved them, I told her. Permits and everything. She frowned. Our guidelines state that visible exterior installations must maintain neighborhood harmony. I pointed at the paperwork in my garage. City code overrides HOA guidelines. You're welcome to read it. For a second, I thought she might argue. Instead, she just stared at the panels, lips tight. People like Evelyn hate losing small battles. You can almost see them storing the moment away for later. Sure enough, the tension never really disappeared. Whenever we crossed paths, she'd give me that polite, thin smile. The kind that says, "We're not done here." And for months, nothing happened. Until one night at around 2 in the morning. Now, when you build a system like mine, you install monitoring software, voltage levels, battery draw, load spikes. Basically, if anything unusual happens, my phone starts screaming like a smoke alarm. So when that alert went off at 2 a.m., it jolted me straight out of sleep. At first I thought something in the house shorted out. But when I checked the monitor, the system was showing a massive external draw, way higher than normal, which made absolutely no sense. Half asleep, I pulled on a jacket and stepped outside. And that's when I saw it. Parked beside my driveway, glowing faintly under the streetlight, was a silver Tesla Model Y charging. From my outlet, and standing beside it, arms folded like she owned the place, was Evelyn Thorne. I just stood there for a second, trying to process the scene. "Evelyn," I finally said, "what exactly are you doing?" She looked over at me like nothing about the situation was strange. "Oh good," she said. "You're up." Then she gestured toward the charger. "You weren't using it overnight, so I figured it wouldn't hurt." I blinked. "You figured what wouldn't hurt?" She smiled, that same tight HOA smile. "Borrowing a little electricity." Now at this point, I honestly thought she was joking. I laughed once, but she didn't laugh back. And suddenly I realized she was completely serious. That was the moment I understood something important about Evelyn Thorne. She genuinely believed the rules that applied to everyone else didn't apply to her. And standing there in the dark, watching my system quietly pumping power into her car, I had the strangest feeling. This situation wasn't going to end with a polite conversation. It was going to turn into a war. And the crazy part is, that night was only the beginning. Because when I checked my system logs the next morning, I realized Evelyn hadn't just borrowed electricity once. She'd been doing it for weeks. And that discovery changed everything. The next morning, I made coffee, sat down at my workbench in the garage, and opened the system logs. At first, I was just curious. I figured maybe Evelyn had plugged in once before, and I hadn't noticed. Maybe twice. But the numbers on the screen told a very different story. Every night for almost 3 weeks, there were these identical spikes in power usage, always starting somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning, always lasting 3 to 4 hours, always pulling enough energy to charge most of an electric vehicle battery. My system tracks everything, down to the minute. Voltage draw, inverter load, battery discharge, solar recovery the next day. There was no question about what I was looking at. Evelyn had been walking over in the middle of the night and plugging her car into my private charger like it was a public gas station. I leaned back in the chair and just stared at the screen for a while. The thing that bothered me wasn't even the electricity. I mean, sure, it added up a few dozen dollars each time, maybe more depending on the load. But that wasn't really the point. What bothered me was the entitlement. The assumption that because something existed, she could just take it. Around noon, I printed out the usage reports, graphs, timestamps, power draw totals. The whole thing looked like something you'd bring into a courtroom. Then I walked 3 houses down and knocked on Evelyn's door. She answered wearing a blazer like it was a business meeting. "Can I help you?" she said. I held up the papers. "I thought we should talk about last night." Her eyes flicked down to the pages, then back to me. "Oh, that." She didn't even pretend to be embarrassed. "You plugged your car into my charger," I said. "Well, technically," she replied calmly, "your charger is outside your home." I blinked. "Yes, and since we live in a shared residential community," she continued. I assumed it was available when not in use. For a moment, I didn't even know how to respond to that. "Evelyn," I said slowly, "that outlet is connected to my private solar system." She shrugged. "It's renewable energy. That doesn't make it public." She crossed her arms. "You generate excess power anyway. I've seen your panels." I tapped the papers. "You've used roughly 80 kilowatt hours from my system this month." She tilted her head slightly. "And that's electricity I paid to produce." She laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, please," she said. "You didn't pay for sunlight?" That line, I'll admit, almost made me lose my patience. But I kept my voice steady. "I'm not trying to start a fight. I'm asking you to stop using it." She stared at me for a second, then gave that same tight HOA smile. "Well, maybe if you didn't want people using it, you shouldn't have installed something that looks like a public charger." Then she closed the door, right in my face. I stood there on her porch for a moment, listening to the deadbolt click. And that was when the situation officially crossed from annoying to ridiculous. But it still could have ended there. Honestly, if Evelyn had just stopped, I probably would have let the whole thing go. Instead, about 5 days later, I opened my mailbox and found an official envelope from the Homeowners Association. Inside was a violation notice. Apparently, I was being formally cited for something called Energy Exclusivity Practices Inconsistent with Community Resource Sharing. I had to read that sentence 3 times before it even made sense. According to the letter, my solar system represented externally accessible infrastructure, and denying HOA members' access could be interpreted as restricting shared utility. Benefits, shared utility. Benefits, I just stood there at the mailbox, laughing like a crazy person, because only Evelyn Thorne could invent a rule that claimed my personal solar system belonged to the neighborhood. That evening, I called my friend Gavin. Gavin used to work with me at a plant outside Phoenix before he moved into residential electrical design. If you ever want someone to analyze a bad idea with enthusiasm, Gavin is your guy. I told him the whole story. The charger, the logs, the HOA letter. There was about 5 seconds of silence on the phone. Then Gavin started laughing so hard I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "Oh man," he said finally. "You're telling me the HOA president is stealing your solar power?" "Borrowing," I corrected dryly. "That's incredible, not helpful." He was still chuckling. "So what are you going to do?" I tried talking to her, and she thinks sunlight is public property. Gavin whistled. "Well, technically speaking, the sun does belong to everyone." "Gavin, I'm kidding. I'm kidding." There was a pause, then his voice shifted slightly. "You know," he said, "if someone kept plugging into a system like that without permission, you could design a load response circuit." I leaned back in my chair. "A what?" "A protective voltage spike relay." Now, if you're not an electrical person, that probably sounds more dramatic than it is. But the concept is simple. You build a secondary port that looks identical to the real charger. But when something draws current, it triggers a controlled voltage surge that shuts down the connection instantly. Safe for the grid, but extremely unpleasant for whatever device just connected. Gavin continued. "Nothing dangerous," he said. "It's just enough to fry a cheap charging cable or scare someone into never touching it again." I stared at the charger outside through the garage window. The wheels in my brain were already turning. "You're saying build a decoy? I'm saying protect your system by electrifying the thief." He laughed again. Engineers call that a learning experience. For the next 3 evenings, I worked on the design. Not because I wanted revenge. At least, that's what I told myself. But because Evelyn clearly wasn't going to stop. And if someone keeps crossing a line, eventually you stop asking nicely. You reinforce the boundary. By Friday night, the setup was finished. From the outside, it looked identical to my normal charger. Same housing, same cable, same position near the driveway. The real outlet had been rerouted inside the garage. The new one? Well, let's just say it had a personality. I also mounted a bright yellow sign right above it. Private power system. Do not use. Clear enough for anyone with functioning eyesight. Which meant, of course, Evelyn would ignore it. Saturday evening rolled around quietly. The neighborhood was calm. Porch lights glowing, crickets chirping. Normal suburban life. Around 11:30, I poured myself a glass of iced tea and sat down at the monitoring console. The camera feed covered the driveway perfectly. Part of me wondered if she'd actually learned her lesson. Maybe the conversation and the HOA letter were enough. Maybe she'd find a public charger somewhere else. Midnight came. Nothing. 12:15. Still quiet. I started to feel a little ridiculous sitting there, waiting for something that might never happen. Then, at exactly 12:42 a.m., headlights appeared at the end of the street. A silver Tesla rolled slowly toward my house, and I knew immediately. Evelyn Thorne had decided the rules still didn't apply to her. She parked beside the charger like she'd done it 100 times before. Stepped out wearing pajama pants and a hoodie. Looked around the street once, casually, like someone checking if a parking meter cop was nearby. Then she walked over to the outlet. The yellow warning sign was right there. She glanced at it, actually paused for a second. I remember thinking maybe, just maybe, she'd finally reconsider. Instead, she shrugged, picked up the charging cable, and plugged it into her Tesla. Back in my garage, the monitoring screen flashed. Load detected. The relay armed. 10 seconds. That's all it took. Then the driveway lit up like someone had fired a camera flash. There was a sharp crack of electricity. A burst of sparks shot out of the charger port, and Evelyn Thorne jumped backward with a scream that probably woke half the neighborhood. Her Tesla went completely dark, just dead. I watched the whole thing on the monitor, sitting there with my iced tea, trying very hard not to laugh. Because technically speaking, the system had worked exactly as designed. What I didn't know yet was how Evelyn was about to react the next morning. And let's just say she didn't take the lesson quietly. I woke up the next morning to the kind of pounding on my front door that usually means something is either on fire or someone is very, very angry. At first, I thought maybe a delivery truck had backed into the house. But then I heard a voice through the door. "Open this door right now." And yep, that was Evelyn. I pulled on a sweatshirt, walked down the hallway, and opened the door. Standing on my porch was Evelyn Thorne, looking like she had not slept a single minute. Behind her stood two members of the HOA board. One was a quiet older guy named Arthur, who mostly kept to himself at meetings. The other was a younger woman named Natalie, who I'd seen walking her dog around the block. Both of them looked confused. Evelyn, on the other hand, looked like she was ready to start a war. "You tampered with my vehicle," she snapped the second the door opened. I leaned against the doorframe and glanced past her. Her Tesla sat in the driveway across the street, looking sad. The charging port was blackened around the edges, and the cable she'd used was dangling loosely. Like a burnt piece of spaghetti, I raised an eyebrow. "Morning, Evelyn. This isn't funny," she said. Arthur cleared his throat awkwardly. "We're just here to understand what happened," he said. Evelyn spun toward him. "What happened is he sabotaged community infrastructure." I couldn't help it. I laughed. "Community infrastructure?" She pointed at my driveway. "That charging station? You mean the one connected to my private electrical system? You left it accessible. You stole electricity." Her mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. That was when I stepped back inside the house. "Give me 1 second," I said. Evelyn started yelling something behind me, but I walked calmly into the living room and grabbed a thick binder from the coffee table. I had prepared it the night before, just in case. Inside were printouts from the monitoring system, energy logs, timestamps, camera screenshots, and a neat summary of exactly how much power Evelyn Thorne had pulled from my solar system over the last 3 weeks. When I stepped back outside, I handed the binder to Arthur. He flipped it open slowly. The first page showed a timeline. Night after night. Charging session after charging session, each one clearly labeled. Arthur adjusted his glasses and looked at Evelyn. "Evelyn, did you actually plug your car into his system multiple times?" Evelyn crossed her arms. "That's not the issue." "It kind of is," Natalie said quietly. Evelyn's eyes snapped toward her. "He created a hazardous device." I leaned against the porch railing. "Actually, it's a protective relay. designed to prevent unauthorized loads. Arthur looked up from the binder. Did it damage the car? I shrugged. From what I saw, it probably fried the charging cable and tripped the car's internal protection systems. Tesla builds those things pretty tough. Evelyn scoffed. You're admitting it. I'm admitting you were repeatedly stealing power from my private system. The word stealing hung in the air for a moment. Arthur turned another page in the binder. There were still images from the security cameras. Evelyn walking up to the charger, plugging in, standing beside the car while it charged, night after night. Natalie leaned over his shoulder. Oh wow, she muttered. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably. That footage was taken without my consent. It was taken on my property, I said. Arthur closed the binder slowly. Well, this definitely complicates things. Evelyn stared at him. Complicates what? He sighed. You filed a complaint saying he was restricting access to community utilities. Yes, but this doesn't appear to be community utilities. She pointed toward my roof. He generates excess power, and that still doesn't make it public property, Natalie said. Evelyn's face turned red. This neighborhood has standards. Yes, Arthur replied calmly. And theft is usually one of them. That line hit harder than I expected. For a moment, nobody spoke. You could hear birds in the trees, someone mowing a lawn 2 houses away. Normal Saturday sounds. Finally, Evelyn straightened her shoulders. This isn't over, she said. I shrugged. You're welcome to call a lawyer. She hesitated. Because here's the thing. If this situation ever reached a courtroom, those logs would become evidence. Clear evidence. She grabbed the binder out of Arthur's hands and shoved it back toward me. You'll be hearing from the board, she said. Then she turned and marched down the driveway. Arthur and Natalie lingered a moment. Arthur gave me a small nod. Nice system, he said quietly. Thanks. Then they followed Evelyn back toward the street. I stood there on the porch, watching them leave. Across the road, Evelyn was already on her phone, probably calling someone to complain about the injustice of it all. Her Tesla still sat there silently, not charging, not moving, just parked. The funny part is, the story didn't end that day. A few weeks later, Evelyn quietly stepped down from her position as HOA president. Officially, she said, it was because of personal time commitments. Unofficially, word had spread around the neighborhood about the late-night charging situation, and people had opinions. Lots of opinions. I never installed the decoy charger again after that. Didn't need to. Turns out, once someone learns the hard way, they tend to respect boundaries. Most of the time, but every now and then, I still sit in the garage, looking at the monitoring screen, remembering that night when the sparks flew, and I have to laugh a little. Because, in the end, all Evelyn had to do was ask. Seriously? If she'd knocked on my door and said, "Hey, can I charge my car once in a while?" I probably would have said yes. Instead, she tried to take it. And sometimes the difference between asking and taking is about 10 seconds and one very loud electrical crack. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Karen Conflict for more. See you next time.